Who started the whole procedure? Who approached who first?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to clarify these issues, because, as you say, there's some confusion. And I should point out, I believe it was actually 2 years ago that I was subject to the scrutiny for the appointment. It wasn't a year ago. And I should also want to make it clear that I've never given financial advice to the former Prime Minister. He's never asked for it. He never received it from me, and I'll get into the details of our relationship. The starting point, in the way you described it, is my long-standing relationship and friendship with Mr. Blyth. He's somebody I met after he'd left university and after I'd left university some 40 years ago. So Mr. Blyth is a personal friend of mine who I've known for some time. As a result of press reports that he had read in September, he raised with me at that time his concern that his cousin, the Prime Minister, was reported in these press reports to have some difficulties. Mr. Blyth raised with me the fact that he was interested in feeling about whether he should do something to help. He raised that with me at a private dinner at his house. I said to him at that time, "You may be a family member, but you need to be very careful. Things need to be done by the book. There are rules in this country, and these rules exist for a good reason. You're a foreigner, and therefore, before you contemplate doing anything or providing any assistance to the Prime Minister, you should involve the Cabinet Office." And that was he raised that issue with me, and that was the end of it at that point in time.
And that was in September?
Yes, correct.
Let's look at Boris Johnson's loan. As we've heard, his cousin approached you at a dinner party and said he wanted to give Boris Johnson a lot of money because, again, to use your phrase, he was in some difficulties.
He did not say that.
He didn't say he wanted to give him money?
No, he didn't. He said he wanted to help him.
Well, what does that mean?
Of course, it implies that it could be money or anything else. He didn't say a lot of money.
Right, so let's not dance on the head of a pin. He wanted to help him out of his difficulties because the Prime Minister couldn't manage on his £164,000 salary. I'm still not quite clear why he didn't, since he was a cousin, just ask Boris Johnson directly, "Do you want some cash, cuz?"
Well, again, I'd say that it's probably worth recalling what was going on at the time. We had no vaccine. We faced a national crisis. We had an economy that was collapsing, potentially. We had no vaccine. And he was concerned that his cousin should focus on the job.
Quite. So the cousin would have taken the phone call, clearly, if he phoned up and said, "I want to help you out financially." Now, originally, we've discussed this.
May I come back to answer?
Yes, please, perhaps in the next answer. You told journalists that the dinner was in November 2020. Now, you've said that the journalists have said they got that wrong. The Sunday Times journalists actually said that they think you got that wrong in the initial briefing that your representative gave them. But that's, we can leave that to one side, because, of course, it would have been illegal to have had a dinner in November because COVID lockdown was on. So you now say that the conversation with Mr. Blyth was in September. In other words, before you applied for the BBC chairmanship post.
Yeah.
So Boris Johnson knew you were helping him effectively with the £800,000 loan when you applied for it.
No, he didn't. He did. First of all, I did not help with any loan. Just to be clear,
Facilitated.
I think the detail, as you said, matters.
So made the introduction. So Boris Johnson knew that you'd made an introduction between him and his cousin, who apparently needed introduced to him, even though he was his cousin, and you'd made that introduction. £800,000 was the figure, huge amount of money, and Boris Johnson knew that this was happening, was in the pipeline before you applied for the BBC chair post.
Even if what you did was technically not breaking any rules, at any point during this process, when you were coming before this committee, did it not cross your mind, perhaps I should mention this?
Candidly, no. What happened, as you'll know from, I'm sure all of you have reread the transcript of the...
Many times.
And
I remember
of the hearing.
not just the words, but the inference that you were very blasé about, it was 10 years since you donated anything to the Tory party, as if this was some sort of distant, long-gone connection, and that you'd only donated a relatively small amount of money in political terms to one person. But the whole manner in which you answered those questions, which I think is as important as what you said, was that this was a distant, long gone, I don't do this anymore kind of thing.
Well, it was quite clear to me at the meeting that we had that you were aware that I'd had a long-standing professional relationship with Mr. Johnson, and that I had been invited back into the Treasury to work during the pandemic, and that I knew Mr. Johnson professionally.
But you didn't think it appropriate to mention that you'd, as you've said, rang the Prime Minister and the Chancellor to tell them you wanted to apply, that there'd been this transaction going on that you had played a part in. You didn't think it appropriate to mention any of that.
Well, that's why I'd raised the issue with the Cabinet Secretary.
No,
and before I met with you,
No, Mr. Sharp, you really have to answer the questions, yes, because this reflects badly on you, not on us, when you don't answer the questions.
I'm seeking to answer the question.
I asked you, did it not cross your mind to mention this to this committee?
I'm seeking to explain that, if I may. I'd had a meeting before I met with you, which was, I think, in early January or mid-January. I'd met in the beginning of December, as I said, with Mr. Case, and I think that the details of that meeting are very important in terms of how it influenced me in respect to this particular issue you're asking. And the fact that I'd raised the issue with him, and he is the Cabinet Secretary, and also within the Cabinet Office is the Proprietary and Ethics, gave me significant comfort in my mind when we discussed that this was that the process of me being excluded would resolve any conflict or perception of conflict. It gave me significant comfort in my mind that the issue had been resolved. And that is why, when I met with you, as far as I was concerned, I was no party to anything, had no part in anything, and the issue was not in my mind with respect to a conflict.
But
and you're asking what was in my mind.
How this could be seen as a perceived conflict?
I can see with the benefit of hindsight.
Can I just ask you, is there anything else you haven't told us or hasn't been reported that might be perceived as a potential conflict of interest in relation to your appointment to the BBC? You know why I'm asking that, don't you? Because you didn't tell us about this before. So just to clear the air on that, there is absolutely nothing that you can recall of anything that might be perceived as a potential conflict of interest in relation to your appointment that you haven't told us, or told the appointments panel, or told anyone you might be expected to tell?
Look, I think in the circumstances that's absolutely a fair question. And the answer is that having had the meeting with Mr. Case on this particular issue, and having discussed the BBC application, and that Mr. Case put in place issues to ensure there was no conflict or perception of conflict, I did not raise it with this committee when you were questioning me.
I'm going to come back to that in a minute. And just to be clear as well, have you discussed with anybody else, or did anybody else approach you, or you discuss with them ways that you might assist Boris Johnson with his finances beyond Sam Blyth? Is there anyone else at any time who's discussed it? So it's only Mr. Blyth. This is the sole occasion.
Correct.
Where you've been
Blyth
involved
is a friend of mine,
facilitating.
And he happened to be a cousin of the Prime Minister,
yes.
And he raised the issue of wanting to help the Prime Minister, and I told him he should talk to the Cabinet Office.
And I'll come back to that again.
I had no discussions like that with anybody else.
Despite your previous answer, I'm still not clear why you didn't tell this committee about your role in facilitating an introduction to someone who wanted to loan money to the Prime Minister at the time. I'm not clear why you didn't tell us.
Because I'd had a meeting with the Cabinet Office, I had a meeting with Mr. Case. I'd raised the issue of my BBC application specifically with him, and he had agreed that to avoid a conflict or any appearance of conflict, I should have nothing further to do with the matter.
You're asking
and
us...
At that stage, any support that Mr. Blyth was going to provide was entirely hypothetical. And I took comfort from that discussion I had with Mr.
I've heard
Case.
your answer, Mr. Sharp, which you said earlier on, and quite frankly, I don't think it's good enough, to be honest with you, in relation to what was expected of you as a candidate. I know you said you were scrupulous in the way you went about this appointment, but if you actually read the questionnaire that you filled in before you appeared before the Select Committee, if you actually read the rules in relation to what you should declare in front of an appointments panel and so on, the fact that, well, let me put it to you this way. You're asking us to empathise, I think, a little bit with the process you went through. How about trying to empathise with somebody who's a member of this Select Committee, whose constitutional duty it is to examine somebody who's being appointed as chair of the BBC for two reasons. One, as to their competence to do the job, and secondly, as to their ability to do that job independently, with full disclosure of any information that might call that into question. And you were probed quite deeply at the time about your connections, previous political connections and donations, and the committee, despite that, was able to recommend that you did cross, you were above the line and you were appointable to this particular position, but you hadn't disclosed to us in full the potential conflict of interest that you were required to disclose by the rules, that you knew very well you were required to disclose.
To Richard Sharp as the new BBC chair, it is important that you no longer ask his advice about your personal financial matters. That seems to contradict what you've just said.
Well, I haven't seen that memo.
Well, it was in the Sunday Times 2 weeks ago.
I haven't seen the memo itself. I've seen the report of the memo, obviously. And in fact, I discussed that with the Cabinet Office. What Mr. Case undertook to me, and I was very grateful for that at the meeting, he said, I will ensure you have no further part in this. And I had no further part in this. And so that memo, and in fact, I discussed this with a Cabinet official, because I only learned about this over the weekend, when as you did, when a journalist put that to me. I learned from the Cabinet Office, it did refer to the meeting that I'd had with Mr. Johnson, which was alerting him to the fact that I was going to go and see Mr. Case. And at that meeting, I did not provide Mr. Johnson advice. And I think it was an ambiguous construction that obviously is open to misinterpretation. I've never given the Prime Minister advice. He's never sought it. I know nothing about his personal financial affairs. And so I take it that phrasing, and I had that confirmed to me unofficially by the Cabinet Office before the article was written, was that referred to the fact that their efforts were to prevent me from receiving any calls from the Prime Minister to protect my position and to protect his, for that matter.
That's an interesting reading of the phrase, it is important that you no longer ask his advice about your personal financial matters. That clearly implies that he had asked your advice.
He had not asked my advice.
So Simon Case is wrong.
Well, that phrasing is wrong. So I don't know who wrote that memo. I don't know if Mr. Case wrote the memo. I heard that somebody else might have written that memo, rather than Mr. Case himself. But I did not provide and have not provided the Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister, personal financial advice. I know nothing about his affairs. I never have done. His financial affairs, and I wouldn't provide him financial advice.
When you say nothing, presumably you knew, because
all I knew was press reports.
Was press reports that he had financial issues, and you were facilitating.
I have no interest in providing him financial advice or getting involved.
Somebody who would help him.
Why did you tell this committee, that you helped facilitate an £800,000 loan for the man who then gave you this plum appointment that you now hold?
I didn't facilitate a loan.
You introduced the person who gave the loan to him. The person who gave the loan told you that he was going to help the Prime Minister with what you call his difficulties. You facilitated it because you made an introduction knowing that it was about money.
I introduced Mr. Blyth to Mr. Case. I did not introduce Mr. Blyth to Mr. Johnson.
But nonetheless, you knew what the score was, and you didn't tell us about it. Let me remind you of what you signed up to on your BBC application. It says the following: You cannot be considered if you fail to declare any conflict of interest. Clearly, this was a conflict of interest. It continues, any issues on your personal or professional history that could, if you were appointed, cause embarrassment or public confidence to be jeopardised must be disclosed. This clearly causes the BBC embarrassment. Why didn't you disclose it?
Just to be clear, I didn't arrange the loan. I did at the meeting.
You helped with the loan. The loan would not have happened, presumably, if you hadn't played the role that you did.
As I said, I was ensuring due process was followed. I can't speculate on what would have happened or not happened had I not had the meeting with Mr. Case.
But tell us why you didn't disclose it.
The meeting I had with Mr. Case explicitly addressed the issue of my candidature for the BBC. And in talking to Mr. Case, I'm talking to the most senior civil servant in the land, and within that area is proprietary and ethics, as you know.
Yeah, but you did disclose it to this committee, that you clearly should have done.
The chair of the interview panel, Sarah Healy, who's at the DCMS, told the Public Accounts Committee that the public appointment panels typically ask whether there is anything else that we ought to be aware of which, if it came to light, might embarrass either the government or the organisation responsible. Do you remember being asked that question?
The interview was 2.5 years ago. And I don't remember all the details, but I think I do remember that question being asked, and I said no.
And you think that was a fair answer to that question?
I've explained to you precisely why, as far as my mind was concerned, and I believe now, that is why I felt comfortable, having had the conversation, explicit conversation. It was an explicit conversation with Mr. Case on this issue, that my introduction of Mr. Blyth to Mr. Case was not in itself that particular issue. So that was why, as far as I was concerned, the issue had been resolved.
It might have been resolved, but you are very well aware of the high scrutiny that your position that you now hold has and has historically had. Anything connected to the BBC is under huge public scrutiny.
Yes.
And it's a bit like when you declare pre-existing medical conditions on an insurance form. You might break your leg and you might have a breathing condition, but they won't pay out on you breaking your leg if you haven't declared your breathing condition. Did that kind of thing not cross your mind, that even if you think you didn't do anything wrong, and you might not have done anything wrong, did you not think that, well, even though it's sorted and it's happened and it's done, that I should actually just mention this, that people might be interested in this?
Like you, and I think like the chair and Mr. Nicholson, it's manifest that this has caused embarrassment at the BBC, and I regret that. And I explained to you at the time why I did not think so, but it's very clear, particularly as my involvement can be mischaracterised and has been mischaracterised, that my activities in seeking to ensure that Mr. Blyth met Mr. Case or the Cabinet Office were involved, clearly that activity that I undertook before that interview.
But Mr. Sharp, it's almost irrelevant what exactly happened, what the exact, conversation, who said what, who met what person, whatever. It's the fact that you were involved in any way, shape or form in this loan arrangement, even if it was simply directing them to the Cabinet Office, telling the Prime Minister that you were going to see the Cabinet Secretary, even if that was the level of the involvement, which is what you say it is, and we've got no reason to understand it's any different, even if that was what happened, what I can't understand sitting here is how you did not think that applying for this job and coming before us at a pre-appointment hearing when you'd got through the interview, that at that point that something in your thought process didn't think, well, even though there's absolutely nothing wrong with this, I need to be open and transparent about all of my actions, that you didn't mention it, that you didn't think it fit to mention it. It just does not add up.
How on earth did you think that was not a relevant matter to disclose to this committee?
Well, as I've described,
do you regret it?
I'll come back to that particular. As I've described to you, I acted in good faith to ensure that due process was followed, including an open declaration to the Cabinet Secretary about the issue occurring at the same time I was applying to be the BBC chair.
I mean, you
with
could
respect,
say, you might as well just say I refer you to the answer I gave previously in true House of Commons style, but do you not see why we might be unhappy about that?
With respect to the regret, obviously, I regret the situation. I particularly regret the situation for the BBC.
That's a non-regret though, isn't it?
No, it's not. It's not at all.
Do you regret your actions in not telling the committee that you had been involved in this caper?
I took, at the time, as I told you, comfort from the conversation I had with Mr. Case.
When Mr. Blyth,
that the issue resolved a conflict and a perception of conflict.
And I don't want to. That's on the record, so we can read that back in the record. When Mr. Blyth approached you about helping the Prime Minister, did you at any point consider, given the position and the fact that you were considering and then were actively pursuing the position of chair of the BBC, did you actually at any point consider saying simply, sorry, I can't help?
Knowing that I'd had the conversation with him in September, when he called me up asking for the introduction to Mr. Case, clearly, I could have at that time said no.
Yeah. Why didn't you?
Because I felt that I could help ensure that due process was followed.
Didn't you think of saying, I can't help because I'm in the middle of an appointments process for a very high-profile public appointment, chair of the BBC, which, by the way, the Prime Minister will have the final say over, the very person we're talking about. What kind of an idiot do you think I am? That I can, in the midst of that process, that I would think it was appropriate to get involved in an affair of this kind?
Well, I could understand why, knowing, as he did, that I worked in the same complex as the Cabinet Office, and that he wanted me to make Mr. Case aware of both his existence and his desire to talk to Mr. Case. And I felt that actually my participation was to ensure that due process was followed and the rules were followed. I regret the distraction this has caused. There's no doubt about that. And certainly I'm, disturbed by the fact that all the tremendous things that the BBC is doing should anyway be overshadowed by this. I'm sure, like most of the rest of you, well,
they're absolutely furious, and I've had a huge mailbag from BBC staff about it. And a recurring question, one of many things they're angry with you about, is the fact that you're not a journalist, but inexplicably chose to sit on the selection panel for the head of news position.
Would you like me to address that issue? Is there a question there?
Yes. Do you understand why they're angry about that?
Well, if they're angry about that, then they don't actually understand, and we need to do a better job of explaining the governance of the BBC as it currently is. May I go on?
Yes.
Okay, so we have a unitary board, and I'm the non-executive chairman. Now, the detail matters. So, for example, if you look at Netflix, they have an executive chairman. And the non-executive often gets overlooked in terms of the meaning in corporate governance. But really what it is to draw a bright line between the executive and how they execute and the board in terms of owning the strategy and the issues the board deals with. And in a unitary board, and this detail is very important in terms of governance, the board has certain critical functions to do. And if you look at those functions, they critically own the strategy, they own the creative remit for the BBC, they own the budget, and they ensure value for money. They have to have, and this goes to our purposes, a framework for assessing the BBC's UK public services, including the World Service. They have to have a policy on the distribution of the public services.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt. I'm going to have to interrupt, because otherwise you'll read out a big long list.
Okay,
you were on the board.
May I come back?
No, I want to pursue that point. You were on the board for the Director of News. That is a journalistic appointment. It is not appropriate, I don't think, and BBC staff don't think, for you to be on the board for a journalistic appointment, albeit that it has board implications. It was fundamentally a journalistic appointment. And I think if I could summarise really in closing,
I'll let you come back after
this. What appalls, I think, so many BBC staff is that you got this job with no BBC experience. Mm-hmm. They knew about the vast donations to the Tory party that you'd given, but they didn't know about the £800,000, something that you withheld from the interview panel, the DCMS Permanent Secretary, and this committee. And I think it leaves the impression so much of this is deeply establishment. It's pals appointing pals, donating money to pals, and I think, as I said in the chamber, it rather leaves the impression that it's all a bit banana Republican cosy.
Do you think perhaps that your position as chairman is now perhaps untenable? Do you think that you can, or do you think you can weather this particular storm?
Look, I believe I've made a significant contribution to the BBC. I've laid out the facts here, and I think it's important to separate those from the things that are not true. And the reason for that is because some of the press has contained significant inaccuracies, and on the basis of those inaccuracies, there's no doubt that has had an effect on some of the people from the BBC, and that's why I'm grateful, actually, to be accountable to you, to subject myself to this particular scrutiny, because I want to set the record straight. And I appreciate, for example, the questioning from Ms. Elliott. But it's very important to come back to the point that I've never provided financial advice to the Prime Minister, that I'm not party to any situation that arose, and it's speculative to know what actually happened. I have no knowledge of what happened, and that my involvement in this was precisely to ensure that due process was followed and that everything was done correctly. And subsequently, I've had informal confirmation from the Cabinet Office that that is their view of my participation in this process. I recognise the difficulty that I put this committee under, and I regret that. But at the same time, this is important because I wanted to create some clarity, because there's been a lot of noise and a lot of mischaracterisation and a lot of erroneous facts that have been put out there.
In sort of your defence, I'll say that just a quick glance at your CV, you've been in charge of governance of non-profit organisation, Royal Academy of Arts, the Royal Marsden Institute of Cancer Research, and you worked 23 years as a partner at Goldman Sachs, and it may well be that you are absolutely the right man for the job. But despite that, the very fact that you're here answering these questions today in public, don't you think it might have made it impossible for you to continue?
Well, fortunately, I have had the chance to meet many. I've been in situ for 2 years, almost 2 years, and I've met, for example, all the employee networks. I've communicated in that sense directly with at least half to 2/3 of the people of the BBC. I believe that they are in no doubt about my commitment and ability to make a contribution to the success of the BBC. And in addition, I think that they understand my belief in public service and the importance of it. I think, for example, you will look back a few weeks' time and see my aggressive support and championing the World Service. And the people of the BBC expect that from the chair, and therefore I do believe they, whilst I regret what this has happened, of course, I do believe the people of the BBC know that I'm striving to protect the BBC and preserve it and make it successful, and that I can contribute. And therefore, of course, this has had an effect on the people of the BBC. But at the same time, notwithstanding some of the messages that Mr. Nicholson has had, I've had a lot of messages of support from people within the BBC, which I welcome. And I would say to any of the people who have expressed their disquiet in text to Mr. Nicholson, my door is open to them, and I'm happy to discuss this particular issue with them directly.
Here's what I think. Had I been approached in this way about helping out financially the person considering me for and responsible for appointing me to a big controversial public appointment, as you already pointed out, I wouldn't have said, sure, no problem. I think I would have heard clanging alarm bells and the dive klaxon of a submarine going on in my head at that point, knowing full well the process I was about to embark upon in relation to this public appointment. Wasn't it a monumental failure? Well, a judgment on your part to go ahead with this?
I did not believe that ensuring that due process was followed was in itself a problem.
That's how you dress it up, but really you were helping out somebody who wanted to lend money to the Prime Minister when it was not your job to do that.
No, I was ensuring that Mr. Case was in a position to get the advice before he would contemplate doing anything involving the Prime Minister.
See, to me, it's just inconceivable, going back to the committee, that in good faith you thought it appropriate not to reveal your involvement in Mr. Johnson's finances, albeit, as you've pointed out, at one remove, to the appointment panel when you were going for this job, and then to this committee. And I think that any reasonable and fair person would come to that conclusion. Would you agree with that?
I'm seeking to lay out the facts here, and the facts are that a fair and reasonable person would see that what I was trying to do was to ensure that due process was followed, that in fact in introducing Mr. Blyth to the Cabinet Secretary, or seeking to introduce Mr. Blyth to Cabinet Secretary, I was ensuring that somebody who wanted to support his cousin was going to go about it in the right way, and that my involvement was to ensure that due process was followed, and that was what I was seeking to achieve.
I may be wrong, but on reflection, I would have thought that a thoughtful person like yourself would realise that deep down inside it was the wrong course of action to take, and that you should have told this committee about it.
You took an action that would make the Prime Minister very personally grateful to you while you were applying for a sensitive job which was in his gift, and you didn't tell anyone about this. As I say, being as charitable as possible, wasn't that an error of judgment?
What I undertook was to ensure that good process was followed. As I said, I sought to put Mr. Blyth in touch with Mr. Case, and I then discussed with Mr. Case the implications of that. I had a long-established relationship with the Prime Minister, which was based upon professional respect. I'd served, actually, for him in two separate functions when he was the Mayor of London. And then in addition, I was working on significant activities when I was in Downing Street during the pandemic. And so I was comfortable in my mind that the Prime Minister knew me professionally, and that as far as I was concerned, the action that I was doing was to put his cousin in touch with the Cabinet Secretary. And that is as far as it went.
So you would do it all the same again?
Well, obviously I've had a lot of time to consider in the last few weeks my participation in this, in seeking to ensure that all the rules were followed. And I wish we weren't where we are now.